the history on our historian. Wendell Huffman serves as a curator of history and the registrar for the Nevada State Railroad Museum at Carson City. A respected railroad historian, he has authored the 44-page Virginia and Truckee Coach Number 17 from Promontory to Carson City, 150 Years. Again, short titles. Which was published 3 years ago by our society. Wendell spent several of his formative employment years working in the lumbering industry in Northern California. I really have no idea whether he drove race logging trucks or not, but maybe he did. And now he's going to shift that hands-on timber knowledge to wood for Nevada, Lake Tahoe, the Comstock, and the V&T. So, welcome, Wendell. Do I push something? Thank you. I know you showed me this. Beautiful. Don't get me started on logging stories. Yeah, that was a fun decade. We drove fast because we got paid by the hour. That never made sense, but didn't make dollars either. The Comstock consumed a great deal of wood. It consumed it in two forms. One was structural wood, timbers and lumber that was intended to be assembled into structures such as buildings or underground matrix of support cribbing. And it also consumed a great deal of fuel. Love that picture. Those 6-foot people standing next to it give it a sense of scale. Interesting thing to me about the Comstock is by the time the cameras showed up, the terrain up there had been stripped of all of its timber, which leaves us with the impression that nothing grew there. And as you know from the train ride the other day, there's a lot of trees around Virginia City. This is a picture I took on the old Ophir Road over to Washoe City from Virginia City. This is less than a mile from Virginia City. Those trees are single-leaf pinions. They're scrubby. They're not worth sending to a sawmill, but there's probably a cord or a cord and a half of wood in each of those. And as a matter of fact, that was the most sought-after wood for the Comstock because it burns hot even when it's green. It always was commanded a price of about 10% more than regular firewood. When they stripped the hills around Virginia City, they moved into the Pine Nuts, which is the range just to the south of Dayton and east of the Carson River. The Pine Nuts cover a large territory. That's Virginia City up where that star is. They cover quite a bit of area, and they never were completely stripped during the Comstock. There were always people going out there cutting wood, and that actually kept the commercial wood people a little bit more honest because you could always get firewood from here. It was hauled into Virginia City in wagons. Log trucks were not the only thing that had more trailers on them than they should have. But if you really wanted a saw log, you went to the Carson Range, which was covered with a good forest of ponderosas and yellow pine and Jeffrey pine, various things like that. That forest extended clear out onto the valley floors on the east side into Washoe Valley and at that time even into Eagle Valley. This map is a fairly incomplete map showing the sawmills of the 1860s. These are the things that sprang up when the Comstock began to boom. And I said this was incomplete. These are only the mills for which I know the location. There's probably another half dozen that I really don't know where they were located. The first mills were the ones west of Carson City, down on Clear Creek and on Mill Creek, because that's where the road was. When they put the road across, oops, back up. First, oh, thank you. When they put in the Ophir Road to Ophir City, the mills in this area came to life. When they put the Geiger grade in 1862, the mills farther north came into existence. Because it's easier to move lumber than it is to move logs, the mills in those days were put in the woods as close to the trees as you could get them. The mills were not big, they were fairly small. This is actually a steam mill. They never got around to finishing the floor, which I liked. And there are no photographs of those early mills. This photograph actually dates from about 1904. The mill was found around Montsville, but it's pretty similar to the kinds of things that you would expect up in the Carson Range in the early years in the 1860s. They only lasted as long as it was worth their money and time to drag logs. This is how you got logs from the sawmills in those days. It took a special vocabulary to manipulate the animals, but you drug the log right on the ground. A real upscale operation would put in a chute like this and let gravity do the work. We know they were using these by 1863 because frequently logs would jump out of the chute and kill somebody, and that would usually produce a note in the newspaper. Three mills that are circled there are different. Those mills were on water. They weren't limited to what you could drag in with a couple of oxen. The one up to the north was at a place called Glendale. The mill was located directly north of the north end of what's now the Reno International Airport. They got logs down the Truckee River from as far away as Tahoe City. They shipped lumber to Virginia City by way of the Geiger Grade, starting in 1865 when they went into business. They did that for a couple of years, but very quickly the Central Pacific got far enough toward Truckee area that became their market, and they produced railroad ties. And then after 1868, when the railroad created the town of Reno, they sold lumber to Reno. The mill down in the lower left corner is the one at Glenbrook. That was the Prey Mill. It was built in 1861 as a water-powered mill, and initially I don't think it played much of a role on the Comstock until they built the road across the Carson Range by way of Kings Canyon. And in 1864 it was converted to steam, and also in 1864 they built a steam launch for dragging logs from a little bit farther away. Prey was from Maine, and Maine was the beginning of the lumbering industry of this country, and I think that's where he knew that if you were on water, you're better off. Prey was a pretty smart cookie. The other mill, the third one that was circled in black, is the one that was located at Empire, just east of Carson City. They drew their logs from Alpine County, floated them down the Carson River. Those other mills, those mills that were in the hills that used the oxen, if they could fill a wagon with their lumber by the end of the day, they were doing good. This mill produced 4 or 5 times as much lumber in the course of the day, and was actually considered the largest sawmill in the western United States at the time, which isn't saying much. It got superseded pretty quickly. Map of the Carson River from Empire down into Alpine County. Most of the trees that went into logs for that mill came off the East Fork because it was just almost impossible to move anything down the West Fork through the West Carson Canyon. Picture of the Carson River. There really is enough water in it at certain times of the year to move logs, but it is shallow, and even though we do know that the drivers of the river rats walked on the logs in their cark boots, if they ever got hung up on a sandbar, you had to get the water and get them off the sandbar. And frankly, I think spending a day up to your waist in ice water when it's 90 degrees or more temperature must have been really an unpleasant job. And this picture, by the way, is not from the local river. All this stuff is going on before cameras made it here. There just aren't great photographs. When a guy looking for saw logs approaches a tree like this, you'd fell it and immediately buck it into logs, and they'd probably only take half of the tree. Once they got into the limbs, they would just leave it, which actually produced less waste than we do today because we limit, and most of the waste is in sawdust. Those old saws would produce a curve that was about a ½ inch wide, and you lost a lot of the tree. But they'd get a couple logs out of that, and the rest of it would be left behind for the wood choppers. Firewood was worth so much money that there'd be a lot of usable fuel in the tops of those trees, in the limb wood. And what they would do to the trunk above where where they got into the top, is they're simply blasted. They drill a hole in it and fill it with powder and blow the thing up, which produced a lot of forest fires. There were a lot of fires during this time period. We complain about the smoke now. I think one aspect of the Comstock that we don't realize, the atmosphere must have been awful from all the wood being burned as fuel. The tops would get turned into cordwood. They would run a boom across the river, the Carson River, and they would throw the cordwood into the river. They would wait for the snow to melt, and then they'd break the boom and let it all float down the river. So this is a fairly small drive getting ready to go. There are stories of some of these drives being 22 miles long. There was one, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but they didn't throw the last stick into the river until they were pulling the first stuff out at Empire. The first obstacle coming down the river is the Mexican Dam. About half the cordwood went down the river through the canyon to the various canyon mills. Even though they were water powered, they used wood to heat the ore as part of the process. But there are all those mills out in Dayton, and they're using wood that's floating down the river as well. The wood that's going to Empire would go down the Mexican Ditch. Obviously, they're both, the dam and the ditch are still there, as is my e-bike. Empire, this is where the golf course is today, and it was just full of wood. Obviously, this is after the railroad gets built. The sawmill was close to where the Morgan mill was. They were right next to each other. The sawmill was gone before the railroad came into existence, though. At that time, there were over 3,000 miles of flumes in California. The flumes were used to move water to those hydraulic mining monitors or to drive mills. The object was to move water, and so they were square because that was the most efficient way to get the maximum volume. This is a two-story flume over at Gold Run, right by the Central Pacific. A fellow named Haynes had the canyon through which the Kingsbury Grade now runs. It's still known as Haynes Canyon to the people that know the name of it. He was producing wood from his wood ranch, as they called it, and trying to get it to the Carson River to float down the river. And the country is so steep down there that he couldn't get wagons up into the hill, and he was trying to come up with a more efficient way to get his firewood down to the river. And he initially built a square bottom flume like they had over in California. It didn't work. The problem was with not enough water, the water spreads out over that flat bottom and it's not deep enough to float anything. And he eventually came up with the V-shaped flume, which concentrates the water and the wood at the bottom. And it worked well enough that he patented it, which is good for us. He lost the suit, but the trial records a lot of the history of the flume. There were a few predecessors that were using flumes to get sawdust away from the mills and things like that. Picture of a wood flume in operation. Another problem with the wood flume, even the V flume, is that the wood goes faster than the water. The water is held back by the friction against the bottom of the flume, and so you end up with a big spray of water in front of the moving wood, and if the flume is long enough, by the time you get to the bottom, there's no water left. So there's still that problem of getting water into it, and all various flumes around here had to deal with that one way or another. 1870 saw flumes built right and left. Haynes flume is down here by Genoa. The next one built, as far as we know, is the Chamberlain flume that came down into West Carson. This is the Ash Canyon flume that comes down out of the Ash Canyon sawmill, which in 1869 Yerington and Sharon bought because they knew that wood was as important as just about anything else. Cleveland's flume up here at the south end of Washoe Valley, a flume down into Franktown, and a flume down into Washoe City from White Canyon. All of these were by 1869. When they started building the Virginia Truckee Railroad, they started at Carson Street. They actually started building in both directions. As soon as the railroad connected the flumes with Empire, they began to haul wood. The railroad was hauling wood before it ever hauled ore. Notice how few sawmills there are. This is 1870. That first map represented 1864. Those mills did not last very long. This is Ash Canyon today. Yerington's mill is down at the bottom of this somewhere. It's a challenge to get there even today. It must have been really exciting back in those days, but you can see the advantage of the flume for getting wood out of that mill and down to the railroad. It's only about 3 miles, but it's fairly rugged country. And another interesting thing to me, I was here in 2004 when this country burned, and clearly it didn't burn everything. It skipped over these canyons in some ways. You can look right up out of town and see the road that goes up there. And if you're really brave, you can go up there. In the early 1870s, this mill is owned by Hobart and Marlette. He was also a partner in the water company in Virginia City and Gold Hill, as were Mackey and Flood and O'Brien and They weren't wealthy people at that time, but they were all partners in the water company, and that gave them a certain subsequent association. But they built a water flume to carry water from Hobart Creek or Franktown Creek out of Little Valley and over to Virginia City. This is where the flume is, which is still sort of famous among people that know what it was. It's the issue with the siphon is that it's about a 2,000-foot drop, and so the hydraulic pressure at the bottom of that thing was 4 or 5 times what the pressure is inside of the steam locomotive boiler. There was just a question of whether the material would actually withstand it. That's the top of the siphon. I didn't mean to jump that fast. And that's looking east, that's Mount Davidson in the background. And the flume, the siphon runs across Lakeview Gap. This is Washoe Lake. And then it pops out of the ground actually over there and runs to a reservoir and then on into the lake. Back up for just a second. After they moved the sawmill from down in this area up here to build the wood for the flume that took the water to the siphon. When that was done, they built a wood flume from their mill down to the mill station, which, interestingly enough, the intake for the wood flume was upstream from the intake to the water flume. So whenever they were fluming wood, Virginia City went dry, which didn't set too well in Virginia City. So what they put in a second flume, which at the time didn't seem to make much difference. But they also started building this line, which came around the hill and started taking water out of Marlette. That was the plan, and this was the tunnel through the crest of the mountain. Even when they were building that tunnel, they recognized that eventually they would start lumbering in this area around Incline, and that tunnel would be their access to get that wood to the Comstock. The tunnel gets started in 1873. Top of the siphon, you can still go up there. Again, it's a challenge. Mr. Meeker does it on his M-bike, though. The 1870s were a boom period for the Comstock. In 1870, the Belcher Crown Point ore body is discovered. In 1873, the so-called Big Bonanza ore body is discovered. These were clear down at the level of the Sutro Tunnel, which we need to remember. The Sutro Tunnel is basically the same elevation as the Carson River, as Carson City. So as you go driving up to Virginia City and you're climbing that grade, remember that's how far the mines went down. And then they went almost twice that farther. And what happened was, even though the 4 mines that were involved in these 2 ore bodies were the only ones paying dividends, all the other mines were going crazy because they were drilling down, trying to find their ore body, which of course they never did. They just found a bunch of hot water. But there was a lot of business and a lot of activity in Virginia City in the 70s in this quest for more ore bodies, even though most of the money, or a lot of the money, was coming out of the pockets of the stockholders. Those are the boilers inside the Yellow Jacket mine. Gives you some idea of just how much cordwood they were using. It must have been a miserable job. The V&T was happy moving firewood. Somewhere along the line, there we go, that'll work. 1873, they complete the V&T between Reno and Carson City to connect with the original part of the V&T. That changes the balance of things. In the first place, the Central Pacific wanted to bring in coal. They had a coal mine in Wyoming, and the V&T allowed coal to be shipped all the way to the Comstock. In terms of percentage of BTUs, I have no idea how much effect the coal had. There was a report of 40 carloads of coal being delivered in a week. That's nice, but that compares with 66 carloads of firewood per day. So the coal, I would say, was fairly minor, but it was on the table. And the other thing was that the V&T from Reno allowed timbers cut in the Truckee area to be shipped to Virginia City. Yerington wasn't particularly happy about that, but during the early 1870s, there was such a demand for timbers that I don't think that was, any attempt was made to stop that at the time. This is a picture of some flat cars with timbers in the 1870s. What interests me about these pictures is these cars are lettered CPRR. Now, once a foreign car got on the V&T would use it for local business. So we don't really know where these timbers came from. They may have come off the Carson and Tahoe lumber flume, but and made a few quick trips up to Virginia City before the cars were returned to the Central Pacific. But those Central Pacific cars got on the railroad at some point, and they probably came in with timbers from the mills upstream above Verdi. One thing that never really occurred to me until recently in rereading some of the newspapers, apparently a lot of the timbers were hewn. There had been a whole class of people that had been making railroad ties for the Central Pacific with their broad axes, so they knew how to do this. I've got 3 different isolated sets of statistics. One suggests that about 10% of the timbers over a particular month were hewn, and one puts it up to 40% were hewn. This picture shows how few tools were actually required, other than the skill to do it, but you've got a broad axe and a chopping axe and a stick to measure it, a pickeroon and a pike pole and a crosscut saw. That's really all it would take if you could make a mine timber every day. You had enough to survive on. 1874, 147,000 cords of firewood were sent down the Carson River. That would take 16,000 flat cars. That was a lot of wood. That's the one for they weren't pulling wood. They were pulling wood out of the river before they finished putting the last of the wood in the river from Markleyville. It was a mess. That was the end of it. Once they had done this, they pretty much had cleared the wood close enough to the rivers to make it economical, and the next year it was down around 50,000 cords. I mean, it dropped off pretty rapidly after that. 1875 was the year that the Carson and Tahoe Lumber Company built their railroad down to Glenbrook. This shows the 4 mills that were by then in place at Glenbrook. Picture of the railroad. In the foreground, this is a wood flume. Wood is being brought in from Secret Harbor Creek to the north. This is actually the top track. The middle track is down here on the switchbacks. The bottom was clear down here. Here's another view of it from the other direction. This is all cordwood that's been thrown out of the flume. The water from the end of the flume comes down this thing and races down this drain. Well, another interesting thing about this, the flume apparently used to drop through here and predated the railroad. You can see this piece of flume has been broken apart when they put the track through there. So there were flumes all over the place that we really don't know anything about. I looked at this photograph, I've done it for years, and never recognized that I was looking at a wood flume in there. There was another flume, came into the bottom of the switchbacks from a lower elevation, and it looks to me, when I was poking around a few months ago up there, that I saw evidence of the sidetrack that would have gone to that flume. There's a sidetrack here, there's a couple of flat cars on it, waiting to get their load. Glenbrook with 3 mills in operation. This is Praise Mill, Mill 2, Mill 1, and the Davis Mill up at the top. There's breakwaters off the shore. Picture from higher up on Shakespeare Rock. This is a flume that's bringing wood down from the Spooner and Pat Mill that was located up on Logan Creek. Again, you can see all these are logs behind the breakwaters. Busy place. I have a friend that lives in Glenbrook who will look at this and say, oh, it's stripped. And I'll look at that and say, man, look at all those trees that are still there. They didn't cut trees below 15 inches. Bliss was pretty rigid about that. They also didn't cut the firs. The firs were of no use to them. And so trees were left behind for a time period. Once the paper mill went into Floreston, the fir disappeared. The logs around the lake were sent down chutes into the water. They were then towed across the lake. Probably, this is the meteor, I believe, maybe the emerald. This is a map up at UNR showing property. Well, I don't know what this shows, to tell you the truth. I think the red is the property owned by Carson and Tuttle Lumber and Flume. The legend on the map was not at all clear, but it does show this area at the south end of the lake in red, and they in fact did have property down there. And in 1875, when they started this system, that's when, Gardner builds his railroad from Camp Richardson down toward Myers. Locally, everybody thought that was the first logging railroad, and they sort of bragged it up. In fact, it wasn't. There was somebody in New York had already beat him to it. This is the old V&T engine that he renamed the Mountaineer. Lake Valley is a little bit flatter than the country further north around the lake, and so they weren't using the chutes quite so much. The log trucks came into their own. They're pulled by oxen. This is his ox barn over here. Log truck, oxen. Language has been silenced. They had to measure all the logs. Everything was measured by board foot. There was a scaling system. And that's what eventually got him in trouble, is he wasn't keeping up with what he thought he should be doing. There was a lawsuit, which fortunately tells us a little bit more about what is going on. Firewood was hauled down to the lake and put on barges and hauled over to Glenbrook. We're looking here at, let's say 1877. You've got the 5 mills in the Glenbrook area. You've got a mill at Swift Station. You've got the flume, the main flume coming down. You've got, to feed that flume, there was a flume that ran from Marlette Lake south. It actually initially went through a tunnel through that ridge, but eventually they replaced that by going around it. Another flume came in from the south. They also did flume wood down those flumes. This is the mill, this is Hobart's mill, still working this where Hobart Reservoir is today, about a half a mile downstream from Hobart, down to Mill Station. I didn't put the water system in. These other flumes by now are just hauling firewood. The saw logs have all been taken out. Mackey and Fair put in the flume out of Huffaker to a couple of sawmills that were up on the northeast corner of Mount Rose. One of these mills employed 124 oxen to haul logs. To give you an idea of what size of an operation it was, those mills had stripped all the saw logs off that mountain, something like 19, gosh, I won't say it. But it only took about 4 years. By 79, it was just a wood cutting operation. and then in 80 the whole thing was torn out because it was just stripped bare. And they supposedly cut everything. But that was Mackey and Fair's operation. After that went belly up, after they ran out of wood, they began to contract with Yerington and with Hobart for firewood and for timbers. Hobart moved the mill from Hobart Reservoir across the ridge and put in a new flume down to Lakeview. This is the one mill that we know exactly where it was because they left the boiler behind when they took the mill out. And the boiler is still up there. Weird boiler. It's spiral wrapped. The wrappers. It's just a really interesting piece of machinery. We all know that the Comstock pretty much came to the end around 1880. They had emptied the main ore body at that point. The Big Bonanza had been emptied. Employment in Virginia City was down. About 10% of the population had moved to Bodie in '79. And all these, the mines that were still in business were still digging down, but they weren't getting anything. And so production of ore really drops. But there was enough business for wood, because digging down still takes fuel, for Hobart to build the sawmill at Incline, and he bought Gardner's Railroad. Part of the lawsuit that he got involved with Bliss, the railroad became available. So the railroad gets moved up here to the north end of the lake. The incline gets built up to the flume. This is out on the end of the railroad. This is actually another flume that was bringing firewood down to the railroad and eventually the incline. These are ox barns. That's the incline, from incline up to the top, where the wood was put into a flume that was flumed through that tunnel. Here is under construction. The flume's not yet built. There was water flume through there and the wood flume through the tunnel down to Lakeview. Terrible photograph, but there aren't photographs of these flumes. They didn't last very long. In 86, this mill burned. There was still enough business to justify rebuilding it. There was still enough wood coming out. There were a number of technological advances during the same time period. One, the original crosscut saws had just had teeth like this. In the 70s, they came up with these raker teeth, which pulled the sawdust out of the kerf, and you could begin to use the saw in a horizontal position as well as a vertical position. So you were no longer having to chop trees down, you were able to cut them down, which relegated the axes to more useful purposes such as shaving. Other innovations during that time period were the steam donkey engines, which led to cable logging. The big wheels were introduced in the 1870s. This allowed you to get the logs off the ground, so you didn't have a problem with friction. You went to horses rather than oxen. You began to get heavier horses because of the importation of workhorses from Europe. Steam engines as tractors were introduced. I've not seen any evidence that any of these were used in the Tahoe Basin, and perhaps not even in connection in a big way with the Comstock. There was talk of using these to haul lumber up the Geiger grade to get lumber from the Truckee area to the Comstock to circumvent the higher tariff that Yerington was putting on timber brought in from the Truckee. But they were coming along. They were on the horizon and people knew they existed. In 1887, Carson and Top Lumber Company Mill #1, the one that was over here, burned. And rather than rebuilding one, they put electric lights into #2 so it could operate 24 hours a day. You can see a bunch of wires out here. The lights were arc lights. I don't know what they had inside the mill, whether they were arc lights. They couldn't have been incandescent. And whether they were just relying on light coming in through the windows, I don't know the details of it. But that was After 87, that's the only mill left at Glenbrook. Shakespeare Rock in the background. That other flume that I showed you was coming down from through this gap from the upper end of Logan Creek. In 86, and again, this is long after the Comstock's over the hill, but there's still enough demand for wood. In the mid-80s, Carson and Tuttle Lumber and Fluting get involved with the railroad into Lake Valley from Bijou down to Myers. There's more history to it than that, but interestingly enough, the newspapers, in 1875, when they first put the railroad across from Spooner down to Glenbrook, the papers are saying there's only enough wood in the Tahoe Basin in the last 10 years. By 85, 15 years later, they're now saying there's 25 years wood just in the Lake Valley. So that gives you some indication of how much consumption had dropped off. But you never knew where the future was going to go, and so Yerington and others were buying timberland down in Hope Valley, and the newspapers would point out that this railroad could be extended over Luther Pass and into Hope Valley someday. Obviously, it never happened. And interesting, you've got cars from the railroad at this is the Lake Tahoe narrow gauge lettering on that car. It's not very plain, but another indication of how much business had dropped off that they're able to bring equipment from the railroad at Glenbrook down here to Lake Valley and utilize the same equipment. The ends of these logs are snubbed for dragging them on the ground, so they're still using a lot of ground yarding. In 1888, Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber has run out of timber up in this area, and so they get some property down the southeast corner of the lake and begin logging down there, and that's the time they extend the railroad down to Sand Harbor, is in 88, because they're starting to barge wood in from the south end of the lake to run through the mill at Incline. In 1889, Hobart, probably Overton, his manager, put in a third flume, or a third siphon and flume to run from the upper end of Little Valley over to Virginia City. There wasn't enough business in Virginia City to justify it, but what they did, the problem with electricity in the 1880s is they didn't know how to transmit it. They were using direct current, and there was just no way to get it any great distance. But what he did is he brought water from Little Valley to Virginia City, ran it down a penstock down the Cholmer mine shaft to a dynamo at the bottom, or at the Sutro tunnel level, and generated electricity there. This is the Nevada mill that was the first electric mill on the Comstock. People do talk about the Sutro tunnel being sort of pointless because it came in so late. In fact, that's what allowed one to drain the water out of that dynamo, and that's what gave Virginia City its first electricity. And electricity was available to businesses also. He was happy to sell it. This is the motor room of that particular mill. This is the situation pretty much in 1890. You've got the railroad at Incline, you've got the Incline mill, you've got one mill still operating in Glenbrook. That's all it takes to feed the Comstock. Now these mills are producing a lot, their output is a lot greater than any of those earlier mills. These are running 100,000 board foot a day rather than those others are maybe 10. This is a picture of the Carson and Tuttle Lumber Company flume yard in Carson City. Toward the end of its life, these are arc lights. Those arc lights went in 1887 up there. I would call it bare ground, but there's a lot of bark on it still. But it's not like the earlier pictures that we see from Watkins, where the thing is just full of wood. It's busy, but it's sort of a mess. The fun thing about this picture, which is actually what started me on this project, a gal who has a ranch down by Genoa has a little building on her property that she thought was a schoolhouse. And she started to remodel it, and she tore the paneling off the inside wall and found this picture inside the wall. It's a remarkable picture that I'm not sure that anybody had seen in recent years, for sure. And it turns out the building was the old office for this wood yard that had been taken down to the ranch. And once this COVID thing is over, Mike Collins and I are going to go down and measure it and document the building. This is a nail hole from where it was nailed in the wall. In 1895, General Electric Company discovered that you could transmit alternating current a greater distance than direct current. And in 1895, they ran a power line from Folsom to Sacramento to run the streetcars. And almost immediately, the mine owners started clamoring for alternating current electricity on the Comstock. And finally, in 1900, electricity from this powerhouse at Farragut on the Truckee River was transmitted to Virginia City by way of that transmission line. Got to Virginia City, and suddenly the Comstock was electrified, and you no longer had any need for firewood. That's the substation in Virginia City. So the problem when the Comstock quit using firewood is that people like you and me suddenly went cold because we couldn't afford to convert our houses to electric heaters or anything else. There was no alternative. And so the residents and people who had small businesses suddenly found themselves in an energy crisis. And what's interesting about this train is that it's a southbound train. This is hauling wood from Truckee or Verdi or maybe Sierra Valleys down toward Carson. This is Virginia Street over here. These are the Huffacre Hills. Lazy Boys down on the other side of those trees, and we're in the Home Depot parking lot to give you an idea of where this train is, and it's heading south. There's 2 carloads of wood up ahead of that boxcar. It's cordwood. That's the cordwood. They've switched off one of the cars at Steamboat. But the world has changed. You're hauling wood to Carson. Suddenly Carson's not in the market of producing wood anymore. Sort of an interesting transition. The locomotive Genoa is still burning firewood, so this is before it's retired. The last flume bringing wood down out of the mountains was the flume that came in at Ophir. That operated until 1910, which probably not coincidentally is the year that the B&T got rid of the last wood burners. They floated firewood down the Carson River as late as 1904. It was probably not coming out of Alpine County, but probably coming out of the area around Genoa. Firewood was over, but the Comstock still needed timbers if they were going to do any mining at all. In 1920, the Comstock merger mill put in a tunnel from their area in American Flat that went back into the Comstock. It ran 3.5 miles, or I think it was 3.5 miles back into the mountains, and it was cribbed with timbers that were brought up probably from Hobart Mills by way of the railroad. So, it doesn't want to see that slide.
Which one do you want?
That one.
That one?
How much wood was used? I don't fully trust the figures that were given. This is 1859 to 89, 850 million board feet. That's the way you measure stuff that's square, or 3 million cords. I've converted those both to cubic feet to give you a sense of comparison. For the cubic footage, I used 90 cubic feet per cord. A cord has 128 cubic feet, but a lot of it is air. But you can see there was a lot more firewood that went into the Comstock than timbers, an awful lot more. And by comparison, this is how many cubic feet are in the Great Pyramid of Giza. So you're looking at a big pile of wood. That's over 30 years. That's a lot of wood. Okay, so what? On a national level, that's nothing. This is how much wood was consumed in the United States in the same 30 years, 450 billion compared to 850 million board feet. It was a drop in the bucket. The Comstock could have not happened and it wouldn't have made any difference. Same with firewood. 4 billion cords nationwide versus 3 billion cords. Again, that's over a 30-year period. A lot of wood. In looking for these statistics and stuff, I read that in 1900 was the first year that the amount of cut timber exceeded the amount of firewood in this country. People had used firewood for so much and continue to use it to this day. In fact, it was sort of funny. About 3 weeks ago, I went up to Virginia City to meet Mike and Stephen and look at the Reno. And on my way back, I met a truck hauling firewood into Carson City, or into Virginia City. And I thought that was really sort of cool. Anyway, that's my story.
Take this back to the room. You want to go up to Virginia? Me and Mike are going to Virginia.
Yes. Where
From around.
some of the water came from Marlet Lake. Where else? What were the other water sources?
At Tahoe, the water sources for Tahoe or for Virginia City?
For Tahoe.
Well, Tahoe's water comes out of the sky. Virginia City had problems before that water system went in.
Right.
And the Marlet, to this day, Virginia City gets its water from Marlet. Now, the tunnels collapsed. The water no longer comes by gravity. That flume's now a wonderful bicycle trail. It's pumped over the hill. There's a power line up there. That's, I've never really poked around. Supposedly, Carson City gets some water out of it too. The tanks at the end of Ash Canyon Road, supposedly the water from Marlet pumped over the hill. Now, the V&T got their water. They had the water rights on Mill Creek. And Ron will tell you a story about stories of going up there with his dad when the V&T system was still in existence, and they're bringing water down initially to Yerington's house and to the shops. They have their own water source. I mean, water's gold in this country. Yes, sir.
When we burn firewood today, we make sure it's really dry. Was there a lot of effort given to curing the cordwood that was coming down out of flumes?
The question on the curing of the cordwood. My impression is no. I think that's why they like the pinions, is because it burns so well even when it's green. There was complaint about the wood that was floated down the river, that it lost a lot of its resin and wasn't as good. And then the pine wood out of the Carson range wasn't considered as good. But I don't think they worried about it. After 1873, after the railroad, or after 1872, after there's a rail connection with domestic coal mines, they're burning coal and wood mixed, both in the mines and then later on the V&T and the engines, they're doing mixed fuel. And that may be related to it not being fully cured. The coal wasn't reliable either, was part of the problem with coal. I don't know, the BTU hadn't been invented yet, so there's no good way to compare other than you can look at consumption and recognize that they're consuming it. The figures I'm getting on consumption are mostly out of the newspapers. The county assessors would do a report at the end of every year, and the newspapers were always looking for cheap fill, and so they would usually reproduce those reports. Another thing with the newspapers, when the numbers were big, there was a lot of bragging about it. But as things started petering out, they didn't talk about it. And finding when sawmills shut down is almost impossible, because the mills shut down every winter anyway. with the expectation of opening the following year. And by the time it doesn't open the following year, no one really cares. And so it's not news anymore. So that's rarely in the paper. One of the Praise Mill was finally burned in 1956. Deliberately. Anything else? Yes, sir.
And most of the rail beds is tunneled from the road.
From Incline south to Sand Harbor, that railroad is now the road. I don't know where the railroad, other than the maps, where the railroad was in the incline that went west. And a lot of the Lake Tahoe narrow gauge railroad that ran from Glenbrook to Spooner, from where that wood flume is at the top of the switchbacks to Spooner, that's highway. You're driving on it there. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that they didn't like fur. What was wrong with
Apparently it's not strong, but the paper mill loved it. For some reason it's perfect with paper. But you know, every wood's a little bit different.
Yeah.
Yes?
You showed a slide with the steam tractor, I believe it was labeled, having to do with the Long Key timber operation. Was that related to the lumber yard in Virginia City?
Long Key's mill was his original mill was just up above Franktown. And then he sold that to Yarrington in '72 and got into the lumber business over at Truckee. But he still owned property in Virginia City and had a lumber yard in Virginia City. So yeah, that was Oliver Longkey, same guy. Anything else?
Follow-up question. What was the time frame of that steam tractor photo?
It's got to be the '80s, maybe the '90s. There were lots of threats of alternatives to the V&T because the V&T had such a roundabout route. It wasn't really hard to say we're going to build something better. And my feeling is most of that was it tended to force Yarrington to give them a better freight deal. Well, I tell you what, we won't build it if you don't charge us for it. And in fact, Mackey had threatened to build a narrow gauge railroad directly from Hot Vickers over the mountain, or from the Truckee River anyway, over the mountain to Virginia City. And he didn't get reduced rate, but he got kickback. And there's at least one check where he's got a rebate on that. And I'm sure at that point, but by the late '70s, you don't want the wood coming in from Truckee. You want to sell your wood that's coming out of Glenbrook. And so you want to keep those freight rates high. But on the other hand, there's no place on the V&T that wasn't more than a wagon's ride away from where you're going, within a day. So the Teamsters were real quick to lubricate their wheels and go back on the road in competition with the railroad. Most of the wood that was floated down the Carson to Empire was hauled by wagon up to Virginia City to avoid having to pay for the railroad. Bottom line, it's all about money. Anything else? Yes?
When did the Hobart Mill close down?
It's not even, the Hobart Mill in Incline went down, it's 93 or 94. I've got the date. You can see it when the post office closes. And then, of course, they moved to Hobart Mills. Walter Hobart had already died, so at that point it was the estate that was making the decisions. But the word is they ran out of wood, which is real easy to believe.
Is that the same mill where the Falcon was?
Yes, the Valkyrie did go to Hobart Mills, yeah. Way back there, yes.
Can you tell us any Northern California logging stories?
The best thing about that job, I worked for a company with 300 trucks, and at the end of the day, somebody every day had an adventure. Something had happened. And we would spend an hour after work shooting the bull, as when we would drift in. Yeah, it was fun.
For the cordwood that shipped down or floated down the Carson to the mills that consumed it, how did the mills, take what they wanted or needed and then pay for it, or who kept track of it?
That's a great question on the counting of the cordwood that comes down the river. I don't really know the answers to that. I know that the wood choppers would stack their wood, and it was counted before it was thrown into the river. So there was an accounting of what they had done, and then after it comes out, it's counted again. And there was always more wood put into the river than came out of the river. You owe me a little bit more than this. The different companies ran their drives independently until that big drive in 1873, and then they did it all at once. And apparently it was sort of a disaster in trying to keep track of everything. One funny wrinkle is that floating the wood down the Carson made the Carson River by law a navigable stream. And that meant that when the wood got to the canyon where the mills were, the mills had to shut down. And a question that I still have is how do they deal with all the dams? Now, there were dams on the Truckee had gates in them specifically for floating wood through them. Whether sections of the dams in the Carson River Canyon were opened for that purpose, I don't know. But of course, the mills were getting wood that way, so it was to their advantage for it to happen. I mean, there was a sense of cooperation. And I don't know how they did it, but these people were involved in every company. I mean, Mills had his finger in everything. And Yerington had bunches of mills. And Yerington had a mill at Genoa and a flume down at Genoa that, I really don't know very much about. There was just a lot of log rolling. That was a great term from that period. They're talking about someone being a log roller. Without using the oxen, the only way you had to move the log was to move it. And the only way you could move your log is to get your neighbor to help you. And so I'll help you move your log if you help me move my log. And so log rolling became sort of a term for politicians that were always quick to help one another. It wasn't necessarily a compliment, and yet that's what people were doing. Yes, sir.
Just a comment, you were talking about log truck drivers. I was a member of a volunteer fire department in Oregon, and several of our firefighters were log truck drivers. You take a log truck driver and put him in the vehicle with red light and siren, you don't want to be anywhere close.
I did get stopped by the head of the California Highway Patrol one time. It was just a fluke, but the ticket I got, the highway patrolman wrote me for 9,999 pounds overweight, which you don't know, but if it was 10,000 pounds, I would have had to pay it. So he was doing me a big favor. Of course, we knew each other. I weighed the log, I weighed the load at the mill, and I was like, 40,000 pounds overweight or something. There's way more to that story, but my nickname after that was Way Over Wendell. Because all my coworkers saw me. I was right outside the sawmill with all these cops around me.
Wendell, thank you very much.